Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Maria Lynn and I work in the archives here at ACHS. We are very excited to present tonight's program, Mortuary Practices, How the Civil War Changed the Death Profession. Our speakers this evening are Dwayne Hills and Neva Fingato. Dwayne is a native of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, and has been a student of American history since grade school. After graduating high school, he pursued an education in mortuary science and has been a licensed funeral director for 46 years in New York, Texas, and Virginia, and was president of Joseph Gawler's Sons Funeral Home located in Washington, D.C. until his retirement in May of 2024. Dwayne participated in the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg as a reenactor and was also an extra in the movie Gettysburg, 1993. Dwayne is the author of 2 books, One Block West of the White House and Washington's Sinners and Saints, which will be available for purchase after the program. Neva Fingato was born and raised in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. She has been a licensed funeral director and embalmer for 20 years and is currently licensed in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia. For the last 14 years, Neva has served as the supervising mortician and general manager of Heinz Rinaldi Funeral Home in Silver Spring, Maryland. Neva is currently on the Mortuary Science Advisory Board for the University of the District of Columbia. And in 2001, she participated in the recovery efforts at the crash site of United Airlines Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after the attack on September 11th. And now, mortuary practices.
Thank you very much. Can everybody in the back hear me? All right, that's perfect. Just so you know, I'm wired. So be careful what you might be saying about me, okay? So I thought, here we are on a Wednesday night, and what is there, 70, 75 people here that come to hear an old undertaker speak and a modern funeral director. I say that because of our age difference. But I wanted to start out, everybody has a funeral director's joke, right? So this one's going to be mine. Did you all hear that Quasimodo died? And the people gathered around. They said to the bishop, who's going to ring the bells in the tower? He says, I don't know, but I'll post the job. So he posts the job, and this guy shows up and applies for the job, but he has no arms. And the bishop says, you can ring the bells? He says, take me up in the tower. I'll show you. So they go up in the tower, and he starts running around and hitting his head on the bells, and he's playing beautiful music, and all of a sudden he trips, and he misses the bell and falls out the window, comes down on the ground, dead. The bishop rushes down. The people gather around. They say, who was he? The bishop says, I don't know, but his face sure did ring a bell. So they said, what are we going to do now? He says, I'll post the job again. So he posts the job. Another guy shows up. He says, I'm here to apply to ring the bells. He says, that was my brother who fell out of the tower yesterday and died. You can ring the bells, play the bell. He says, yes, take me up in the tower. So he goes up and he's pulling the cords, making beautiful music. All of a sudden he trips, falls, and goes out down the window, dead on the ground. The bishop comes down. The people gather on. Well, who was he? A dead ringer for his brother. Okay, when I got asked to do this gig tonight by Neva, we were going to talk about embalming. And I'm surprised that there's this many people that are interested in embalming. She offered if something happened to me during the day today, she was going to do a live demonstration up here tonight. So I behaved myself. But anyways, I'm going to start out by I'm going to give you my definition of embalming. It's the disinfection and the preservation of dead human remains. And people ask, well, how does that work? Well, down through history, which we're going to talk about a little bit tonight, the methods have changed. But in the current environment, just so you have a good feel for modern day embalming, I was never much of a chemist, but it is all about the chemistry. And formaldehyde is the main chemical used to embalm a body. It is a chemical that attaches really well to water molecules. So you need to get this fluid throughout the entire body, so we use the circulation system. So we mix formaldehyde-based fluids with water, inject it into an artery, and where the arteries and the veins come together are the little capillaries. And the capillaries is where your body gets fed nutrients, oxygen, all these things. And we know the body's made up of this huge percentage of water. So as this fluid is going in, the formaldehyde, which is a gas, passes through the capillary walls and attaches to water molecules in your body. And by this pumping action, circulation, it's pulling the water out of your cells. And that is why when someone is laying in the casket, if they were embalmed, they might feel firm, because you've removed the moisture. You're removing the moisture. And by removing the moisture, you slow down decomposition. Any question on that? That's the technical stuff. Yes, sir.
So where does the water go?
After,
in the blood system.
Well, you have to, if you're pumping something in, you got to let it escape. So there's different areas of entry, but for an embalmer, the best entry is the carotid artery. The fluid gets injected in the carotid artery. The vein is right there next to it, the jugular. So a little incision's made, an instrument is slid in there, and that's where it exits. And you can literally, we call it a textbook embalming, where everything goes perfect. You can literally see the change, because like your lips are pink. That's from blood flow. So a lot of times people say, oh, you're draining the blood. Well, in the process, some blood gets drained, but it doesn't necessarily remove all the blood from your body.
How long does that process take?
Depends on the condition of the body. In a textbook case, and correct me if, there was a time when I could embalm a body in 45 minutes. There would be cleanup time and all, but 45 minutes of injecting. Other times it might take 4 hours. Because there's so many things like trauma or disease that changes our internal
medication.
Yeah. So, good question though, yeah.
Formaldehyde, isn't that what they put the frogs in when they want to maintain the specimen?
Preservation. Preservation.
But it's liquid.
Well, it's because they have to mix it with a liquid. More likely it's water in most cases, okay? Yeah, formaldehyde in itself in its true form is a gas. So we're going to talk a little bit about the theme was how embalming changed the landscape of funerals, the funeral service of families from 1800s up through today. So Neva's going to address a little bit of that, and we'll keep this going. Anytime you have a question, pop up a hand. We'd be happy to try to answer that.
Funeral practices before the beginning of the Civil War were mostly done in the home. They were very quick turnaround just because of the body and it starting to break down and cause issues. So it would be nothing to have a funeral at the home, go to the church, go to the nearby cemetery. At the start of the war, with so many deaths, they realized we need to do something to be able to return the soldiers back to their families wherever they are. Transit at that time was mostly train, and they started to have regulations as well. No one wants to have a body in poor condition traveling that long on a train. So the modern father of embalming would be considered Dr. Thomas Holmes. He was a medical school student. He was a surgeon in New York, and he started to experiment with ways to better preserve cadavers for the medical schools. He adopted some practices from Jean-Nicolas Ganal from Paris, France, who also did that. His method of arterial embalming for these bodies was basically just cutting into the carotid artery, injecting straight arsenic for the preservation. They found out the arsenic cut down on anything with bacterial growth, fungus growth. Unfortunately, anybody who operated on those bodies after he did this became sick with arsenic poisoning. So Dr. Holmes took it upon himself to figure out what's a better way that we can do this. His experiments, again, were through the arterial embalming, through the carotid, similar to what Dwayne said. And he mixed a little bit of different. So he had some arsenic, he had some creosote, alcohol, zinc, and mercuric chloride that he mixed and he used. And he found that it was better preserving the bodies, it was less toxic to the people that were around them, and he was having a better result. Once the Civil War began, like I said, there was this sudden need to return these soldiers home to have their final burials. The start of the embalming really began when an Army colonel was killed. He was a very close friend of President Lincoln's, and he was killed, and Dr. Holmes was called upon to help him.
Okay, so this is Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. And if there's any history buffs in the room, Civil War history buffs, you've heard of Ellsworth's Avengers. Well, Colonel Ellsworth was a friend of the Lincolns in Illinois, and he followed Lincoln, campaigned for him and all, but he started up a Civil War unit out of New York City, and they were made up mostly of firemen, volunteer firemen. Okay, so they had these red pants. They were an easy target because they stood out with their colorful uniforms. Well, early on in the beginning of the war, they looked across into Alexandria, Virginia, and they saw where there was a Confederate flag flying over a building. So he took some of his men, they rushed over there and rushed upstairs. It was an inn, tavern, and they tore down the Confederate flag, and as he came back down the steps, the tavern owner shot and killed him on the spot. And then the tavern owner was immediately shot and killed by Ellsworth's men. So the body was taken back to D.C., and Dr. Holmes got a hold of the president because he knew they had this close relationship and said he would like to, if they would give him the opportunity to embalm the body, and then it could be shipped home. So they did that. Dr. Holmes embalmed the body. The Lincolns, the president and Mary, went and viewed the process, saw the results, and that's when Lincoln decided this is an opportunity to be able to return the men home from the battlefield to their families. So he commissioned Dr. Holmes to embalm Union soldiers, which he started to do.
He actually Dr. Holmes became commissioned in the Army as a captain, and he was in Washington, D.C. where he practiced, and then he also started to go out onto the battlefield. What he would do is after a battle took place, he would come out, erect the tent, and then he would start to tend to the dead. He charged $50 for an officer for embalming and $25 for an enlisted soldier. This would also allow him to get them home and get their travel on the train. Unfortunately, the way that he would promote himself and his skills with embalming is the embalming surgeons, as they were called, would start to embalm unknown soldiers and place them in a crude wooden casket and set them up in the corner of their tent to show off their skills. They would also try to advertise and change prices. It eventually went up to, I believe, $60 and $30. At this point, Dr. Holmes realized that he could do better in the private sector, and he resigned his commission as a captain and did his own and started charging $100 per body to embalm those. Unfortunately, during this time, a lot of people realized, hey, there's some profitability in here. We can do our own. And they were rushing into battle and setting up their tents, even allowing soldiers to prepay their own embalming and their transportation home in case they were killed in the war. We have a little feeling that we are very protective of our passion for funeral directing, and we think this is where a lot of some bad juju, so to say, came from.
Yeah, 46 years in the business. I've heard every joke. Okay.
They're dying to see you.
Yeah, and I'll be the last to let you down. Okay, but anyways, there's always been a stigma. People have felt that the funeral directors were ripping people off, catching people at a bad moment, and different things. And oftentimes, like today, in the day of social media, somebody says something and it can change an entire group of people's feelings about something. But I wondered, as I was helping to prepare this, there was a Mr. Burr, right? Is that his name?
Yes. It's the gentleman in the photo here.
Right. He would go out and he would literally scoop up a body, embalm it, and send notification to the family. But he wouldn't release the body to them unless they paid him. Okay, so he was kind of made out to be a little unscrupulous. And sometimes I wonder if that isn't the beginning of people's angst against funerals. Just my own personal conspiracy theory. But yeah, he was a shyster. And but this whole prepaid deal, General Grant, toward the end of the war, was I think it was January 1865, because these guys would set up, within the camp and all, and he thought this is not too good for morale, right? You're getting ready to march off a bunch of people to a battle, and you can pay for this ahead of time. So he ordered them out of the camps. They had to stay on the outside of the lines to do their bidding. But I'd like to stop for just a second, because there's somebody in the room I want to introduce. My history, as she stated, was I got privileged to be the president of Joseph Galler's Sons in Washington, D.C. And it's absolutely one of the most historical funeral homes in the United States. If you could see the list, I have a list of notables that they've buried. It goes back all the way back to two of the Lincoln conspirators Gallers took care of back in 1865. But we have a fourth generation, right? Galler in the room tonight. And that's Bob Galler sitting over here. I don't want to embarrass you, Bob, but his family changed a lot of things in funeral service as well. And Joseph Galler started in 1850, so he was already, 10, 11 years ahead of the Civil War. Now, I don't believe back then they were really doing embalming, because that was a little premature to that. But he was a cabinet maker and, started going out to the homes, getting the bodies ready, and they would hold something at the house. He'd come back, he built a coffin, take it back to the house, put him in it, take it to the church, to the cemetery, or wherever after the funeral in the home. So I'm very honored that he's here tonight, and his wife Lois. And then there's also some other people in the room. Camille, she worked at Galler's for 12 years, from 1969 forward. And it's just, to have that on your resume is pretty cool, I think, to have been privileged to do that. But they also were very involved in changes in the industry. Galler's was the first to have a motorized hearse in D.C. I believe it was 1914. They were the first ones to introduce, when vehicles came into being, headlamps being turned on for a funeral procession. One of the Gallers was sent to Europe after World War I to inspect the graves of United States soldiers killed overseas. They manufactured caskets. They had their own little plant where they manufactured, caskets, and were involved in casket designs and all. So I just had to stick that in there because that's very important to me. The best gig I ever had in the profession was working there.
That is where I got the pleasure of meeting Mr. Hills. He was our buddy when our funeral homes were merged by one company. And to say that I've had him as a friend for the past 14 years has been a great success, and being able to work with the Gallers family has been great as well. So back to the point at hand with embalming. So Dr. Holmes, he would embalm on the battlefields, now farther back because they were a little sketchy there. His embalming would take place very similar to how Dwayne explained earlier, but he would go in through an incision under the armpit, and he would use a machine, just a pump ball onto a hose, similar to one of the items here. They would fill the jar with embalming fluid, which he also patented and started selling for $3 a gallon. He would have the hose in there, he would place it in the artery, and then he would pump that with the ball. It could take many hours to embalm a body. Unfortunately, due to how the soldiers died and the amount of time they laid on the battlefield, there was really no need to drain anything from the deceased because that had already taken place naturally.
Was there any butting of heads with like William Hammond and the military doctors who were into getting specimens and soldiers and doing autopsies for the Army Medical Museum?
I'm sure there probably was some sort of butting heads because that always seems to be in any.
Because the Army would sit, if somebody wanted the body of their son back, and they're like, oh, no, we need them. They would negotiate, okay, well, we just need the leg, you can have the rest of the person.
Here's an interesting thing. Your question brings this to my mind. The Medical Military Museum in D.C., Joseph Gawler had a younger brother who literally was the curator of that museum for like 30-some years. Can I tell the skull story, Bob, or not? Okay, so this when the Lincoln conspirators were hung, the government buried them immediately on the prison ground there in D.C. And then over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, the families would petition President Johnson for the bodies. So one by one, they slowly started moving them to a private cemetery, a family plot. Lewis Payne or Powell was not, his family never called for him. So finally the government wanted him off the prison grounds. So Joseph Gawler was hired to come and disinter him, and they took him to a cemetery in the DuPont Circle area of Washington. A few years later, they decided to disband that cemetery for growth of the city, and those people were all disinterred again and taken to a cemetery called Rock Creek Cemetery, which is another very old cemetery in D.C. So Lewis Payne made his journey to Rock Creek. As I was researching for my book about this very story, that museum you were referring to, they somehow had the skull of Lewis Payne. They had it for a number of years. They gave it to the Smithsonian Institute or Museum. They have a skull collection. Anybody here collect skulls? You do? All right. There's always one. Every crowd, there's always one. So anyways, people started writing about this. Well, anyways, the Smithsonian decided they were going to do something with all these skulls. So a lot of them were indigenous American Indians and things that they wanted to return to, to their lands and all. So they found out that Lewis Powell's mother was buried in Florida. So his skull is now buried next to his mother. So there were all kinds of blogs and stuff out there like, how did they ever come by this skull? So I'm doing my research, and I learn about Alfred Gawler. Yeah, well, this was Joseph's brother. Oh, your grandfather is named after him, yes. I found out he was the curator of that museum for like 35 years. Now, can you picture this in the late 1800s? Hey, look what I have. You want this for the museum? Where's my museum people here? I think I solved that mystery, but I've never published anything about it. But that's an interesting question. But you see, here was another thing in that time period. They were called resurrectionists. True story. I wrote about it in one of my books here. In the late 1800s, as these medical schools were getting cadavers, at that point, there was there was nothing about donating your body to science. There was no regulation other than if you were a body snatcher or a resurrectionist and you got caught, it was a misdemeanor, so it was a slap on the hand. So literally, it started in Boston, that kind of went Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., but there were people, like this one case, they hired this woman in D.C. She would attend the funerals. Now, no doubt she was at some Gawler funerals. I know she was. So she would go to the funeral, didn't have any idea who the person was, go all the way to the grave with them, and that night they would come back and dig up the corpse. And in the cover of darkness, they would deliver it to a medical school in D.C. They'd be paid some money, and they literally were called the resurrectionists. So the government finally cracked down on that, and they passed a deal where you could donate your body, which so that kind of eliminated the need for the resurrectionists, because now there were people willing to say, I'll be a specimen for you, okay? But that was and people were making all kinds of iron cages to put over the graves and stuff to try and prevent that from happening. And they literally would dig down at the head of the grave, like that little casket over there, or coffin on the wall. It's got a glass deal on it. But they would break open the head end. They would literally put a rope around the person's neck and pull them up out of the grave. True story. Yes, sir.
Just going back a little bit, you were talking earlier about $100 for an officer and $50 for a enlisted soldier. That was a lot of money back then.
Absolutely.
So I guess the families were expected to come up with that amount of money, but was it considered gouging to be charging that much money back then?
I'm sure. I think probably because of the novelty of it, first of all. You could either have, your loved one could be decomposing on the battlefield or just buried, where they fell. I mean, that's the thing about Gettysburg. I was talking earlier with the director here. There's still hundreds of bodies buried in Gettysburg. I think the last one that was really found was maybe like in 1989 or something. 96. But you just got to know that out of the thousands. And here's another thing about you could pay for that insurance and all, yes. But, who had the better chance of getting embalmed and shipped home? Was somebody who was wounded and taken to a battlefield hospital and then died there because they weren't laying out there, days on end, maybe before they were either buried or removed from there. So they had a better opportunity of actually having their bodies prepared and shipped back home.
What percentage of the soldiers actually got involved in shit?
Okay, it is estimated out of the 618,000 casualties of the Civil War, that would be both sides combined, there were 40,000 soldiers embalmed. Dr. Holmes claims to have embalmed 4,000 of them. And the story is, when the war was over, he went back to Brooklyn a wealthy man. To answer the question here about was that considered expensive. It's still considered expensive today, right? At least that's what you would be told.
Many of the soldiers as well that prepaid for their embalming, so they're not a burden on their families, were worried how they would know that they were to be embalmed. So they would pin things on their outside of their uniform to hopefully prevent it from being stolen, because if they died across enemy lines, there was a chance that they would be pickpocketed and everything removed. But they wanted to let others know that they were going to be embalmed. They had paid for this service, and to please make sure they got to one of the embalming surgeons that had a tenure on the battlefield, which is a bit morbid in these days. So
in 1862, Willie Lincoln dies in the White House. Okay? Because the Lincolns were so impressed with Colonel Ellsworth's embalming, they decided to have Willie embalmed. They would hold his body in D.C. until the end of the president's term, and when they went back to Springfield, Illinois, they would take him back and bury him in the family plot. So there was an embalmer at the time. His name was Harry Cattell. He was called upon to embalm Willie Lincoln. He embalmed him in the White House. His little casket was taken to Oak Hill Cemetery, which is in Georgetown, and he was placed in this large family vault, the William Thomas Carroll family. William Thomas Carroll was the clerk of the Supreme Court at the time, friend of the Lincolns. He was placed in one of the crypts, and Lincoln would actually go there on horseback, and he would go and have the tomb opened and the casket pulled out, and he would sit and visit with his son. Times were different then, okay? Death has taken on so many different meanings to people down through the years. So when the president was assassinated, Mary wanted him embalmed as well. And he went on a 20-day journey to get him back to Springfield. He was put on a special train made for him, and with all these stops, they mirrored his stops that he had taken coming to Washington when he accepted the presidency. So in preserving his body, they were able to literally open that casket at a lot of these different stops along the way. So that was he was the first president to be embalmed. I think every president since then has been embalmed because they've either lined in state, not all of them lied in state, but I wrote a chapter in my book, Gallers took care of Woodrow Wilson, and he was literally embalmed in his bedroom. You can go to his house on S as in Sam Street in Washington. It's a museum. Like for $5, it's a pretty worthwhile little deal there. And you'll note if you see pictures of his funeral, there's no American flag on his casket because she was mad at the administration and the government because when he went to Europe to try and set up that deal with the European nations and he got voted down, and then he had his strokes and all, she felt very betrayed. And his body is actually in the Washington National Cathedral. He's the only president buried in D.C. But that was the trend where embalming became more and more popular. Because it's the same thing in this business, and I've watched this down through my career. If you have a very notable person, so let's say, who was the person I mentioned earlier? Like the trends change.
Oh, JFK Jr.
Right. So when JFK Jr. was killed tragically in his plane crash, he was cremated. Irish, Catholic, traditional family forever, and they do a cremation. That changes the trajectory because people, like popular opinion, oh, that must be the way to do it now, okay? And then after that, along comes Lady Di, who has a very traditional funeral, and the pendulum swings the other way again. And you can literally watch that. It's just like we're all creatures of watching something happen and being influenced by it. But I'm gonna make a very bold statement. I probably won't be around to see this, but I was telling Neva earlier today, in 20 years or 30 years from now, there's probably not going to be any hearse manufacturers because it's not going to be necessary. Or the beautiful facility, the Galler Funeral Home in Washington, D.C., Neva's facility in Silver Spring, because people are less and less holding traditional type memorials. But that's the evolution that, the path that we're on. Who knows, something may swing that back. But I've seen it in my lifetime where embalming has become less and less popular, let's say. Okay, I'll shut up for a minute.
With the death of Lincoln, that's what really switched funerals from the traditional home funeral to more so in a facility or a undertaking business, where the traditional cabinet makers now had the undertaking of performing funeral type tasks with that. Due to this, in 1882, the undertakers came together and formed the NFDA, which is the National Funeral Directors Association, which is still in effect today. And that started to help govern what we were doing and to eliminate those horrible practices of embalming a body and placing it on the corner and saying, hey, look what we can do. Come on in. We can do this for you too. So in 1894, Virginia was actually one of the first states to enact a board to start overseeing the different, and by 1900, there were 24 other states that had also started to oversee the education, the type of services, the technical aspects of funeral directing, and to govern those into this day. In the census in 1890, 9,891 people listed their occupation as an undertaker. That was on the 11th census. On the 12th census in 1900, 16,189 had stated that their occupation was an undertaker. Fun fact about Dr. Thomas Holmes: when he died in 1900, prior to his death, he stated that he did not want to be embalmed.
Go figure, right?
Which is, if you ask any funeral director now, it seems that is still the same case, that they don't want anything big like that, which is sad. But
Why would they decide not to?
Okay, let's talk about another person. Back in 1963, there was a lady named Jessica Mitford. Anybody ever hear of her? She wrote a book, The American Way of Death. And it was a scathing expose of the funeral business. Okay, she was totally against funeral homes, funeral directors, anything to do with the death care business. Okay, but when she died, she had some big elaborate funeral. Now, it may not have been her idea, but let me tell you a little story about that. Her influence. We talked about influence. She wrote that book in 1963. Who died in 1963? John F. Kennedy. Okay. In steps the Gawler family. Bob's dad was very involved as one of the funeral directors in that service. But when that was being decided, like who do we call? Which funeral home do we call? Now, D.C. probably at the time had, 30 or 40 funeral homes. And there was this big discussion about whoever you pick, you're going to have 38 others that are going to be really mad. And they said, but this guy who was advocating for it was with the Military District of Washington, and he said, but Gawler's has experience in that. They had buried FDR. This was before Eisenhower, but Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft. They have experience. These are the people we need to call on. So Bobby Kennedy had just that year read that book by Jessica Mitford. And he says, I do not want a civilian funeral home involved in this. So this gentleman who's trying to advocate for that, he says, Robert Kennedy says, I want the United States Navy to take care of the body and have the funeral. Well, they had certain mortuary affairs and were capable of certain things, but this guy kept saying, no, we need to have Gawlers in charge of this. And basically, I think Bobby Kennedy was stepped around, my understanding, and Gawlers was called. And in a short period of time, he gets shot, dies at like 1 something in the afternoon on a Friday, and his funeral is Monday. He gets flown back from Dallas, Texas, that afternoon into the evening, is taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital. There's an autopsy performed. The team from Gawlers went to the hospital, embalmed the body there at the hospital, dressed, cosmetized, made repairs to his trauma, had him in a new casket because the first one was damaged, and had him in the East Room of the White House by 2 in the morning. So they called the right firm. People with experience that knew how to deal with that. And that's always amazed me, that amount of time, that they pulled off a state funeral that there was no plan for. Nowadays, there's a plan. And Gollers, nowadays, is involved 4 times a year in doing a full dress rehearsal for state funerals. We get up early in the morning. We're at the United States Capitol building at 4 in the morning to get ahead of the spectators and the tourists and literally do a full dress rehearsal of taking a casketed body or a casket into the rotunda with all the pomp and circumstance. We practice going to Andrews Air Force Base, like receiving a body off the plane, returning it to the plane. They go to the Washington National Cathedral, practice arrival, departures, go all the way into the cathedral. So now there's a plan. And when a president goes into office, a plan is written. So just a little sidebar on that, but that's how that all plays out. But it always amazed me that they were able to pull that off. Matter of fact, in my research for the book, The Eternal Flame on Kennedy's grave, I told you his funeral was on Monday. Sunday afternoon, the superintendent of Arlington National Cemetery received word that Jackie Kennedy wanted an eternal flame. And he's thinking, I'm not an engineer, so they got a hold of the folks, the engineers up at Fort Myer, which borders the cemetery, and they came up. Now, the eternal flame that's there right now is not the original one, but they came up overnight with one where they had a long copper tube, and they had a propane tank over in the trees, and created that for her. But very interesting. And another thing people don't realize, like 3 years later, they literally went and disinterred. Now, the conspiracy theorists would love this. They disinterred Kennedy and moved his grave over a ways and reburied him. Anybody in the room know that? Stick with me. No, it's some interesting history there that all stuff that, when I was researching the book and all, it was so interesting to learn some of these things that I didn't know anything about. But pardon?
Why did they do that?
Because I guess when they first put him there, it was done there again rapidly. And I think they wanted to position him better on that hillside for doing the memorial around it. Now, here's another cute story. You can stop me.
Go ahead.
Last year, in November, it was right around the time of the anniversary of Kennedy's funeral, I had a group of about 75 people, so about this many people, came into Gollers. We were very famous at Gollers for giving tours because of our history. And so these people were all licensed tourist guides in D.C. Now, everybody look at me. See the color of my hair? What little I have left? So I'm up there giving the talk, and question and answer, a lady raises her hand. She says, "Can you tell me what it was like to sit and meet with Jackie Kennedy to make his funeral arrangements?" And I looked at her and I thought, we're the same age. I was in kindergarten. She says, "Oh, I'm sorry." Oh, Lord. I just had to throw that in there. That one threw me back just a little.
How prevalent was it? You hear these stories about how they had probably in the Victorian era, they had windows in the top of the
Right.
coffin, and they had little bells and all that. How prevalent was all of that?
Yeah, I think it was very prevalent back then. The whole, I think the idea of the window is, like when Mr. Goller would get, there used to be a little chalkboard that hung outside the funeral home. Somebody died at night, they would write the name and address. In the morning, he'd check the board, and okay, I got to go out to K Street and pick up Mrs. Smith. So they would load up their equipment, go to the house, and they would take what's called an ice chest. It was the shape of a coffin, but they would put blocks of ice in the bottom. The body would be laid out on top of that, and then the lid would be put down, and the lid would have a window in it. And then for a day or two or however long they waked the person at the house, people could come and look at him. Now this was prior to embalming, okay? So then he would go back, and then the day of the funeral, he would bring the coffin or the casket, depending on what year it was, take the body out of the ice chest, put it in the coffin. They'd hold the service. So, you know, as these things progressed, it became more and more opportunity for that cabinet maker to turn that business into the funeral business, because he was taking the burden off from the family of dealing with the body, transporting the body. And then in 1870, Gallers picked up a property across the street on Pennsylvania Avenue. They were blocked from the White House. They bought a property that had been the headquarters of General Winfield Scott, who was the top general in the Civil War, in the beginning of the war. And they put up a modern 3-story funeral home. And they had what we called slumber rooms, and it had a chapel in it, because they were encouraging people to take the funeral out of the private residence, bring it to this building designed as a funeral home, and hold the services there. So this was all an evolution to what you have today. And in my 46 years, I probably have taken maybe 6 people to their home. Back then, it was everybody in the beginning. Everybody was waked in their home.
My father would talk about when he was a child, he was born in 1930. And,
Yep.
you know, you could tell by the banner on the house what was going on.
Yes, it was called a door badge. And somebody died. Matter of fact, I looked back through all the old funeral bills at Gallers, and for like $2 or $3, you got a door badge. So there'd be this big floral piece that would hang on the front of the house, and that notified your neighbors that there was a death in the family.
That's also still common practice a lot in the South with Southern funeral
Yep.
homes as well, even to this day. Another piece that's back there that the museum has been nice enough to let us kind of talk about is one of the cooling boards, which is similar to what Dwayne did, and that was before they would place them on ice or dry ice. They would lay them on a cooling board, which is in the back corner there. It's made of wicker, so it let air go to hopefully keep the body cooler while they did the wake or the viewing in the home itself. You also mentioned the bells. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but that was an old thing that they would string a bell down to where the body was buried just in case it woke up. Since there was no embalming practice with
buried
that.
alive,
So
yeah.
they would sit there and wait, and the wake would be is when they would wait to hear if the bell would ring or if somebody would wake up during that time.
Yeah.
So that's where some of the words still come. Wake is still a very Irish used term. When we're making arrangements now, we have an Irish family come in, they said, well, we got to have the wake, where it's been called other things such as visitation, viewing.
Yeah, the terminology, we've had to be very careful down through the years, because, you know, in any business, you pick up a certain slang or terminology, right? And I've had different staffs before. We had to be very careful because, like up in New York State where I worked originally, in the wintertime, they shut the cemeteries down. Okay? The bodies would be placed in a little building, or what we called a receiving vault at the cemetery, until spring rolled around when they could dig the graves. So when we would pick up the phone and we would call to have, you know, the grave digger prepare the grave, or the vault company, or the family, we had to be careful, because behind the scenes we called it, it's going to be just a drop. Well, are you going to drop my mother? You going to drop her on the way to the grave, or what? You know, so you have to be kind of careful with our terminology sometimes, or we call them spring burial. How would you like to be a spring burial? You know, it's just yes.
I grew up in Massachusetts, so we had the term wake, but we also had the term Irish wake.
Yes.
And the Irish wake was that night.
Yeah, that involves a little alcohol, right? Yeah. Yeah, if the body didn't wake, you were going to go to sleep eventually yourself, right?
There's different things geographically as well, such as caskets. I am from rural Pennsylvania up in Elk County. We have a casket, it's called a full couch casket, and what that describes is the whole lid of the casket comes up. I started in Virginia, and then in Maryland now, we have a half couch casket where only half of the casket opens, so you see basically from the waist up for families. It's also fun if you don't remind a family that they need to bring pants in for the visitation because they think that part is covered. So that can make it interesting. But
Yeah.
geographically, and again, down in the south, things are still where they have the door badge. They have things where you deliver chairs to the home because they're having everybody at the house for their repast or their reception after the service.
Here's another little interesting, I get hung up on the Kennedy funeral a little bit, but the casket that came from Dallas that was damaged, it was a bronze casket. The funeral director in Dallas was ordered to bring the best casket he had to the hospital, Parkland Hospital. So he grabs a bronze, okay, that's a pretty pricey casket. Brings it there, they wrap the president in sheets, put him in it, and put him on the airplane. They pushed the funeral director aside and jumped in his hearse. And he's just standing there, and they're driving off with his brand new hearse because he really thought he was going to probably do the preparation and all. And so anyways, that casket, that evening,
This is the Secret Service doing.
well, yes, his personal details and all. And that evening, a group of his crony friends from Massachusetts, some of them, came in and selected a casket at Gawler's. They selected it was called a 710 mahogany, made by Marcellus Casket Company out of Syracuse, New York. They were like the premier casket manufacturers at the time. Gawler's had a very exclusive arrangement with them. So they purchased that casket. It was taken to the hospital. The bronze casket was brought back to the funeral home. Down in the basement, no one's ever been able to explain to me why, but there are 2 crypts, iron crypts in the wall with a door on it with a big lever. So that casket was put in one of those crypts. The following March, when Bobby Kennedy finally worked out a deal with that funeral home in Dallas because they thought he was charging too much, back to my original point, negotiated a price, settled on it. The guy in Dallas was offered $100,000 if he'd sell the casket to somebody. So he started saying, oh, the casket belongs to me, you won't pay me, I want my casket back. So then the government finally stepped up to the plate and they negotiated a price, and it wasn't $100,000, I can tell you that. So in March of that following year, the National Archives took the casket. I have actually the exact day that happened. They took the casket back to the archives, and then eventually it was taken out on a transport plane, weighted down. It was encased in a plywood type of crate, and they sank it in the Atlantic Ocean because they didn't want it to become a circus attraction. So I have a little plaque down there that tells the story of that over that crypt. And in the other crypt, I'm off subject. Okay. Anybody ever hear of Gideon Welles? Secretary of the Navy in Lincoln's administration. So one day I get a phone call. Well, let's back up a little bit. There's a statue down in Gettysburg Square, and Lincoln's standing next to a guy in a cardigan sweater. I think it's like, what do they call it? The new Lincoln? I don't know, something about modern Lincoln and the modern man or something like that. I was there the day that was dedicated. And there was a woman there that was featured that day. She was the wife of Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. She was married to the last surviving Lincoln. He died in 1985. So he had already passed. She was there representing the Lincoln family at the statue dedication. Was anybody there from here? Or? It was a cold day. We sat in the shade by the Willis house. It was cold. And the sculptor was there and all. But anyways, I got my program signed by her. So I get a phone call from the great-great-grandson of Gideon Welles. He says, hey, I have a casket I'd like to give you. I understand you have a little museum there at the funeral home. He says, in an auction, there was an item lot that I wanted, and this casket was a part of that. He says, now, the family that was, their items were being auctioned off was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith's family. Okay. She had since died, the lady I met. She had a daughter from a previous marriage. He says, I have the casket that Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was laid out in for his service. He was taken out of it and cremated. Would you like to have that casket? Sure. So in that other crypt, we have that casket. That casket holds the potential holding the last DNA of the Lincoln family line. How cool is that? Can I get around with the No, just kidding. Those are the exciting things, though, that my career path has taken me on. And being a lover of history, as a child, I was brought here to Gettysburg on numerous occasions by my grandfather, and we would hire a guide. He would hire a guide and drive us around. And I was more interested in that little hat, that little kepi, and the plastic sword that we used to get in trouble with. I don't know if we've gone over our time allotment or... Any other questions? We haven't had very many questions from over here. There, right there's a hand.
For the Civil War soldiers who prepaid for their embalming, if they survived the war, did they just lose their money, get a refund?
I would guess that would be the case. Be like the undertaker or the surgeon, find me, right? Not like today, you could look them up on Facebook, right?
One other question. I've read there were several cases during that time when they were using arsenic of people who were accused of murder by arsenic. And their defense would be, oh, it wasn't me, it was the embalming fluid. But I had a doctor tell me that's not true, because if you're poisoned by arsenic and you're alive, your fingernails would be striped. And if you're injected after you die, they're not. But would they have known that during the Civil War?
No. I doubt it.
I wouldn't think they would.
Yes, sir.
The boards that you have, there's a certain pattern of holes drilled in the bottom and numbers, purpose of those holes or those numbers?
The holes are most likely for drainage of some sort. The numbers on them might be something that was specific to that organization that had those, would be my guess. Gentleman in the gray shirt.
My question is, and you touched a little bit on President Kennedy, but also in the battlefield with the musket ball wounds or the artillery shell wounds, tearing up their vascular system. How does the embalming work in that?
Not very well. No, seriously, trauma. I've thought about that myself. I'm sure that even if there was an attempt on a situation like that, it was probably a very poor job. Yeah, because you definitely, if you interrupt the circulatory system, you're kind of out of luck. You might be able to embalm a leg or an arm, but to get maybe a complete job if the person had a lot of trauma, I mean, I think of time. I mean, I've dealt with some traumas in my career, and I had modern methods, and I can't imagine with the crudeness of the instruments they would have had, and lack of experience even. I mean, these guys just kind of
death as well. Just how long they might have laid on the battlefield dead.
See, I picture it as like somebody saying, "Hey, we ought to go chase after these battles and say that we're embalmers and do whatever for the money," right? I mean, I can picture that being the case. Inexperience, just, fool me once, fool me twice.
You mentioned the cooling board and the embalming jar. Could you tell us about some of the other artifacts around the room, so when we're finished with your talk and we know what we're looking at?
Certainly. There are different types of cooling boards, such as this one over here. It's a wooden one. Most likely that was not an embalming board. Some of those were a crude setup. As you can see in the picture, it was a door placed on two barrels. So in the time of battle, when they needed to do that, whatever was a flat surface that they could do. But these are mostly cooling boards. There is I believe it's a child-sized casket with the glass panel. Again, the glass panel was to allow you to still view the deceased and hopefully keep some of that decomposition inside the casket. On the other side, there are more of a cot, a traditional cot back in the day, cooling board, and then there's a child-sized one as well. The embalming fluids up here, these are just old glass bottles from different companies, as well as the old wooden crates that they used to come in. This is from my personal collection that I have from over the years. There's a lot of neat things that the society here let us use to do that, so it was pretty cool. There was a question back here.
Yeah, you talked about sort of an embalming cocktail that replaced the arsenic, but when did formaldehyde come into use?
That was later in the 1900s as they, again, perfected and realized arsenic's probably not the greatest thing. And that as the person decomposes, that does leach into the ground. So I believe it was the 1930s?
30s, I would say.
Is when formaldehyde started to become a more widely used chemical.
When bodies were transported on train, what were the procedures for that? Were they just treated as freight?
Yes.
Yeah, there would be a freight charge, yeah.
There's a freight charge there placed in a special car, just in it.
That used to be right up until, World War II and all that. Bodies were shipped all over the country on trains. It was not uncommon for the funeral home to go to the train station, pick up the next person, especially during the wars when the bodies were shipped back. You know, the Spanish flu in 1918, I did some research on that. I wrote a chapter in there about that too. That was overwhelming in Washington because you had soldiers coming back from the war in France and all. I mean, they were literally arriving in D.C. So there were deaths. I think there was a few days that Gaulers took in like 20-some bodies in one day from the Spanish flu. But a lot of those people, as I was reading through the records, were, shipped back to Kansas, wherever they were from. So I'm sure Gaulers had vehicles going to the train stations, and they would be put in a big wooden, plywood type of crate to be transported.
Yes.
The early embalmings, how long was that good for?
Again, it would just all depend on the weather,
The job.
the job, how bad the body had trauma, the type of material that they were using to embalm, if it was straight arsenic or anything like that.
A couple of days, a week?
Most likely it was a couple days to a week because it would take a bit to get the soldier home by train. So
A body starts to deteriorate rather quickly. And depending on moisture, temperature, things can happen pretty fast. So let's say a body is there for 2 or 3 days before the embalmer even gets to it. Nowadays we have refrigeration. So the body's put in refrigeration if we can't get to it, or if the family's trying to decide if they're going to do that or not. That affords us more time because it slows down and retards the decomposition. That they didn't have any such thing then. So yeah, it either had to happen pretty quickly or it was going to be out of control. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about a union system. Do you know anything about what happened with the Confederacy? Did they have the same sort of practice?
they did start to have those practices mirrored off of the Union soldiers. Depending where you research, it was the embalming surgeons could go back and forth between the lines without any issues to do that, just because it was for the general purpose of returning the soldiers home.
So to follow up on we prepaid but then didn't die, did the embalmers follow the same units, or like if you paid this guy but then you died somewhere else and he didn't come with you, like who's gonna get you done when you're?
I think at those points it was
Nobody.
And the other part is, so he paid and the embalmer does it. Does your family know that you prepaid, or is the embalmer trying to get paid twice?
6 one way, half a dozen the other.
Back to my theories. Yes, ma'am.
Post-mortem photography, when did that kind of stop?
Stop or start? Oh, when did
Well, started when they had cameras. But
yeah, I mean,
I don't think it's ever really stopped because I still have families that decide
it's
to
not
take
as
pictures.
common now, but there's some really cool pictures out there that you can find from time to time, and they're worth a lot of money too. They really are. People pay big dollars for those, especially the old tintypes or daguerreotypes. But you'll find the real heavy ones on a cardboard type of material. I'm going to say right up through probably into the 1950s. That was still popular. But there again, as